Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeobike. Today is the official 11th video and unofficial 7th video of my series on early U.S. Imperial expansion. The subjects of today's video are the Sauk and Meskwaki, also known as Fox nations, and their battle for the heart of America in Illinois during the early Imperial United States. So, right off the bat, I'm sure many of you watching, especially those of you in the US, but also I'm sure quite a few of you outside of the US, when you hear the phrase Illinois, you think of the state of Illinois as seen on this map. Uh, and that's not an unfair conclusion to come to. After all, Illinois has had its has been a state in the United States and had its territorial political boundaries for between 150 to 160 or a little more years uh, of our history. So of course, literally everyone who was alive, both within and outside of the United States, the only way we have known about Illinois is how it is now, is the state of Illinois. But it's important to remember that's not the entire picture. Uh, Illinois only took on the shape that it has now after a long series of processes, events, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the larger picture of how Illinois came to be the way it is now, we need to go back a little bit in time to get a better look at the larger picture. And that leads us to the first section, the Mississippian period in the North American Midwest. So the Mississippian period is named for a cultural phase uh, in a cultural group known as the Mississippian culture that first arose actually as a cultural ethnogenesis in the what is known as the Middle Mississippian region, or what we would call the Midwest. And the uh, entirety of Mississippian culture uh, really got its origins with the first massive metropolis to be constructed by Native Americans in the what would be contemporary with, say, medieval Europe, and that is Cahokia. With Cahokia, as I mentioned in my videos on the Mississippian period, as well as in my video on misconceptions and myths about the medieval period, Cahokia had a population of between 20 to 50,000 people and rivaled some of its period of existence actually had a higher population than London. And it's the height of its power, of its regional center. The height of it being a regional center in a metropolis happened right around 900 to 1350 CE or AD. However, while it arose as a singular city, while Mississippian culture arose as a singular city, uh, after Cahokia arose, Mississippian culture began to spread across all of the eastern woodlands of North America, specifically including but not limited to the lower Ohio River and other confluence areas, as you've seen here. Uh, and in this lower Ohio River area, you begin to see the emergence of Mississippian cities and Mississippian sites, such as the Kincaid Mound site, which had its apex as a metropolis and cultural center from around 1000 to 1450 CE, as well as the Angel Mounds site, which had its apex as a metropolis and cultural center from around 1100 to 1450 CE, uh, but was shortly followed after its decline by the late Mississippian carbon whalebone culture, which had its apex as a cultural phase from around 1400 to 1700 CE. And then towards the end of the, actually, something that's important to mention. So, those of you watching and who have seen my previous videos, especially the one preceding this on the Choctaw Nation, you might be wondering, it's like, hey, dang, why did Mississippian culture decline in the 1500s in the American Southeast, but continue into the 1700s in the American Midwest? And that's because the American Midwest was much farther to the center and far away from European colonial powers who were, of course, arriving to the Americas via the coasts in areas like the southeastern part of the United States. So essentially, they were far enough away that they could actually continue as a cultural entity uh, for much longer and not run into European explorers for a much longer period than, say, the American Southwest or the American Southeast. Okay, so now that leads us to our next section, the migration of the Sauk or Sac, as I've also heard it pronounced, and Meskwaki Fox nations, and their first contact with Europeans. So, the according to their oral histories, the Sauk or Sac and the Meskwaki Fox tribes uh, originally lived somewhere along the East Coast, somewhere around modern day Massachusetts or New Jersey and New York, before migrating to present day Michigan, uh, somewhere between 1600 to somewhere in the 1660s CE. Uh, However, and also contemporary with this, uh, while they were migrating to Michigan, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, more commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but the proper name is Haudenosaunee Confederacy, was slowly beginning to push out the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations out of Michigan, uh, out of Michigan territory into present day Wisconsin during the latter half of what was known as the Beaver Wars. Something I have already covered in a video, which will be included in the iCard. Uh, After this, uh, and also during the Beaver Wars and after the Beaver Wars, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations would begin to meet with French missionaries, which were their first encounters between the French Empire and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. Uh, After that, during the 1680s, after their forced migration into Wisconsin, the Sauk and Meskwaki nations would begin to have sporadic conflicts with the Dakota Nation. Uh, and then eventually, between 1712 and 1738 CE, the Sauk and Meskwaki nations would go to war with and eventually be defeated by the French Empire in a series of wars known as the Fox Wars. And they would be then subsequently pushed to the Wisconsin River near the modern day borders of Wisconsin and Illinois, where the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations would actually begin to intermingle and intermarry. And here are the sources that I used for all this information. And here is a map just sort of contextualizing all of that information that I just talked about. Uh, Eventually, and this is a map of the location of the Sauk and Meskwaki nations, as well as other Native American nations after the Beaver Wars and Fox Wars. Uh, and again, you can see the Sauk and Fox Meskwaki Fox nations here. in the Dakota, whom they were now entering sporadic warfare with. After their forced migration, second forced migration, I should say, after their second forced migration at the hands of the French into the borderlands of modern day Wisconsin and Illinois, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would begin to consolidate their new lands uh, and begin to essentially make it their own as much as they could between roughly 1740 and 1760 CE. You can see that here. Eventually, both during and after the consolidation of their new homelands, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would side with the French against the British and their allies in the 7 Years' War, which was a massive worldwide conflict between an alliance of different nations led by the British Empire uh, fighting against an alliance of another alliance of different nations led by France. Um, with this war eventually resulting in the defeat of the French Empire by the British Empire and its allies. After the French defeat during the 7 Years' War, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations, alongside other Native American nations such as the Odawa, Miami, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi, would devastate the Illinois, also known as the Illinois Confederacy, uh, and occupy their old territorial range alongside the Illinois River. Afterwards, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would go on to found the city of Saukanook as their main population center and spiritual home. And here is the Illinois Confederacy here in orange on this map. And there's their old territories, and you can see here in the yellow is the territory that they lost at the hands of the warfare with the various tribal alliances, including but not limited to the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations. And there is a map, a very old map of the village or city of Saukanook. And here's a sort of a diagram of what it would have maybe sort of looked like during that time period. Eventually, after their seizing of this territory from the Illinois Confederacy, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would begin to have sporadic contact with both the Spanish and the British empires. Which actually leads to our next section. The Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations and their relationships with the United States. And I say that contact with the British Empire and the Spanish Empire leads into this next section because during the outbreak of the American Revolution, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would actually side with the British Empire, at least nominally, and this would also be their time period in which they would actually first have contact with the United States. Once this war got kicked off, as I said, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would actually side with the British and would help them in their failed attempt to retake the city of St. Louis from the Spanish Empire, who had allied with the United States. With this failed siege taking place on May 26, 1780 CE. After the defeat of the British during the American Revolution at the hands of the newly growing United States, the United States would go on to create a region, a territorial region under their control known as the Northwest Territory, which you can see here. Because of this, The Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations would become angered by this and would go on to join the Northwest Confederacy to help uh, the alliance of the Northwest Confederacy that had been founded in response to the rise of the United States. And they would help the Northwest Confederacy raid the United States forts during the Northwestern War. However, the United States would eventually go on to defeat the Northwestern Confederacy in the Northwestern War, with the Northwestern Confederacy being defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers by General Anthony Wayne. 10 years after the end of the Northwestern War, five Sauk and Meskwaki chiefs led by Quashquame uh, and United States emissary William Henry Harrison would meet at St. Louis, where a treaty would be signed uh, uh, between the two nations in return for a lump sum payment of $2,200 and an annuity of $1,000, which officially, uh, though not though not permanently, ended conflict between the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations and the United States. And the reason I say not permanently is because just 5 years after this, William Henry Harrison, who was now governor of Indiana Territory, would go on to negotiate the purchase of 3 million acres of land from various Native American nations in what would become known as the Treaty of Fort Wayne, while also angering other Native American nations who were excluded from the treaty, such as the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. Um, and see here, the area of the map here designated 6 and 7 is the areas of land that were bought in this treaty. In response to the continued encroachment by the United States and the Treaty of Fort Wayne, many Native American nations, such as the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, but also not limited to the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, would go on to join Tecumseh's Confederacy at Prophetstown. And this confederacy began to be constructed by Tecumseh uh, between 1808 and 1811 CE. And I've already done talked about this in depth in my War of 1812 video, which will also be linked in the icon. However, despite this alliance coming together, while Tecumseh was away on a diplomatic mission to the Native American nations of the Southeast, attempting to have them join this confederacy as well, William Henry Harrison would gather a U.S. Army as well as U.S. militiamen and would go to Prophetstown, where he would defeat Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee Prophet, at what would become known as the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 CE. And here is a depiction of that battle here. However, that would not be the end of Tecumseh's Confederacy, nor would it be the end of Sauk and Meskwaki Fox battles against the United States, because with the outbreak of the War of 1812 in 1812 CE, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, along with Tecumseh's Confederacy, would ally with the British Empire against the United States. And during this alliance and during this war, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox warriors would go to join the British, led by a war chief by the name of Black Hawk, to help the British drive the United States out of Illinois country, which they successfully did. This happened between 1813 and 1815 CE. And there is Black Hawk, and there is the various series of battles that Black Hawk participated in. However, this warfare would eventually come to an end, especially after the conclusion of the War of 1812, uh, which ended. The official statement is it was a stalemate, but again, I've said this repeatedly in several videos in the series that in reality, the British won the war because they won the most, almost all of, if not all of, the strategic victories and accomplished all of their goals, their aims of the war, whereas the U.S. did not. But either way, regardless of whether or not you think the British won or not, the war came to an end, which led to this establishment of peace between the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations and the United States. And this peace overture was really brought upon, was really sort of overseen by individuals such as William Clark of the Lewis and Clark fame, who was appointed governor of the Missouri Territory, and Ninian Edwards, who was appointed governor of the Illinois Territory. And there are those territories you see here, Missouri Territory and Illinois Territory. So after William Clark was appointed governor of Missouri Territory, and after the conclusion of the War of 1812, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox chiefs, including Black Hawk, albeit Black Hawk was very reluctant to do this and was actually the last of the chiefs to show up. They would meet with the United States emissaries, including but not limited to William Clark, to conclude hostilities between the United States and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations by signing the Treaty of St. Louis in 1816 CE. Now that brings me to our next large section, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Society during the early U.S. imperial period, as well as before, in early European colonization as well. Starting with Sauk and Meskwaki Fox culture. First off, in contrast to most of the Native American nations of the continent of the North American continent, not all but most, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox culture was a patrilineal society, meaning kinship was traced through the male line, a person identified with their father's lineage, and property was passed down through their father's family. Essentially, very like the modern day society of the United States. But very similar to, in fact, exactly the same as most Native American nations, at least in North America, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations and cultures were a matrilocal society. So, meaning that when a young couple married or marries, they live with the woman's family. And then there are other similarities, if not exactly the same practices between the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations and other Native American nations in North America, such as the idea of an hexagonous clan system, meaning individuals are expected to marry outside of their clans or other groups in addition to outside closer blood relatives. Because oftentimes in many of these cultures, for example, in our previous video on the Choctaw Nation, incest was seen as it was very much seen as a taboo in society, and this included marrying as part of your clan, marrying a member of your own clan. Women were, again, very similar to, if not exactly the same as other Native American nations in North America, were in charge of farming and mining. Men, of course, were chiefs and in charge of hunting and war. Marriages could often include multiple wives, though not always. And again, very similar to most Native American nations in North America, women had a great deal of influence in things such as picking their spouse. And here is my source for all this information. Now we go to take a look at Sauk and Meskwaki Fox warfare. So first off, warfare for the Sauk and Meskwaki nations uh, were a very important way for men to gain social prestige. Um, Very much like, for example, in our previous video, the Choctaw Nation, as well as other, if not all, Native American nations in North America. Warfare, and the same could be said for this line of that read. Warfare consisted of raids and ambushes, and was often focused on obtaining captives, which again is a pattern and a trend we see in most Native American nations in North America. Warriors would employ strategies such as using spies to obtain information about enemy villages. They would hide in forests during the day and travel at night. They would attack at daybreak while their enemies slept. They would travel slowly and cautiously in enemy territory, and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations would often, when Sauk and Meskwaki Fox warriors were out on a raid, they would oftentimes leave hidden food caches for their return home. Uh, any Sauk and Meskwaki Fox warrior of good standing could gather and lead a war party. However, warfare was not taken lightly by the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. A warrior gathering a war party must have a medicine bag, a powerful talisman passed down from father to son, and must have had a spiritually, or must have both tenses, present and past tense, work. A potent, they must have or have had a potent spiritual dream containing uh, good omens. If the warrior has had a dream with bad omens, or if bad omens appear during a raid, the raid would be canceled. After the war party was gathered or is gathered, the war party would then go on to fast and conduct spiritual ceremonies to prepare for the raid. War parties usually consisted of 20 or more warriors. Now, there's no absolute idea of how many warriors the Sauk and Meskwaki nations could field, but the best estimates we have state that the Sauk and Meskwaki nation, the Meskwaki Fox nations, could field uh, from somewhere between 700 to as many as 1,300 warriors for the Sauk Nation, and 400 to as many as 1,400 warriors for the Meskwaki Fox Nation, um, bringing the total to somewhere around nearly 3,000 warriors that the Meskwaki the Meskwaki Fox Nation and Sauk Nation both combined could field. And this would lead to a warrior to general population ratio of roughly 6.1 at the lowest and 2.1 at the highest. And this is important to note because, as I talked about in my video on the Northwestern War, as well as in the video on the Era of Good Feelings, oftentimes the United States kept the number of soldiers that it itself could field for war fairly low. During the Northwestern War, up until the final couple of years, the United States only had an army consisting of between 2,000 to 3,000 men. So essentially, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations were equal in military might to the United States in its earliest years. And while, of course, those numbers went up during the War of 1812 to tens of thousands, after the War of 1812, as I talked about in my video on the Era of Good Feelings, the United States brought that number down to a little over 6,000 U.S. soldiers. So while the United States still had slightly more soldiers than the Meskwaki Fox and Sauk nations, it was not that much more, and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations were very much a territorial power and a force to be reckoned with, and were oftentimes seen as a military threat, a very real and viable military threat by the United States. Though it's also important to remember, again, is really all of these things I mentioned could be said. much like most, if not all, Native American nations in North America, and really, as far as the last point I'm about to touch on goes, in the Eastern Woodlands, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nation, as well as other Native American nations, would use a game called stickball as a substitution for war to settle disputes between nations and villages. Um, and this would be done one because warfare, of course, was would oftentimes lead in deaths and members of the community dying. So settling it in a not necessarily a peaceful way because this was used um, as a substitution for war for a reason because of its roughness. Uh, Essentially, stickball is the predecessor to lacrosse. Anyone who has seen lacrosse knows how violent it can get. And so that's essentially the reason why. But you know, it makes a lot more sense to do that than to you know drive an axe or an arrow or or a bullet or whatever into somebody and kill them. But not just that, uh, young men would use stickball to train themselves in the ways of war, again, because of its roughness. Um, and warriors would use stickball as preparation for upcoming wars and raids. With all these practices together, leading stickball to be called the little brother of war. And here are the sources that I used for that information. And there is a picture of stickball. And again, it looks a lot like lacrosse because it is lacrosse. I mean, there are some minor differences, but it's essentially the same game as lacrosse. And both lacrosse and the traditional version of stickball are still played by basically all of the Native American tribes that originated or still live in the eastern woodlands of North America. Now that brings us to this little section where we need to, because we've looked at, how warfare was conducted by the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, but now we need to look at what Sauk and Meskwaki Fox warriors looked like during the 1800s and really also during the early years of European colonization, and what types of weapons they used during these periods. So generally, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox warriors look to varying degrees like these individuals here. These are all various Sauk and Fox chiefs, but they would also look something like this. Some of them would ride horses, like you see here in this figure here, who's titled number one, who is a Sauk or Sac chief. I've heard it pronounced both. But also you have over here a Sauk warrior right here from around the period of 1832 CE. And much like basically all of the Native American nations in the Eastern Woodlands, when it came to up close and personal combat, close quarters combat, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations used a variety of different styles of war clubs. Now, of course, when anyone hears the phrase Native American, uh, due to pop culture, when we hear Native Americans and warfare due to pop culture, most of us tend to think about the use of tomahawks. And yes, tomahawks were indeed used. Um, they had various different styles that were used, but they generally looked something like this. But it's important to remember tomahawks are a subset of the weapon classification called a war club. So while yes, tomahawks were used, you also had a variety of different war clubs that were used. You had some war clubs that looked sort of like maces, like European maces, like this one here, or they would have a hard sort of nodule ball on it for used for blunt force trauma. Though some examples, like you see, like this one you see here, would have a spike or spikes sticking out to cause more damage. And then you had a variety of what were called gun stock war clubs that were always generally shaped something like this, though there were various different styles. Some had one or more metal blades or stone blades before steel was implemented, uh, protruding out of them. But others were just simply pieces of wood like this one you see here that would be used for blunt force trauma. So they would still be used as weapons. They just wouldn't have the blades sticking. And of course, after contact with Europeans, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations would begin using various types of guns like muskets and pistols. Uh, and while the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, as well as other Native American nations in the Americas, did have metalworking prior to European contact, uh, especially involving copper and bronze. After European contact, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations began to use steel or iron knives in place of stone or copper and bronze knives, like you see here. All right, so now that we have looked at uh, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox culture as well as how they conducted warfare and what their soldiers and weapons looked like, now it is time to go to the government of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. So the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations are and were divided into two divisions. These were the long-haired and the brave divisions, which were then further subdivided into various patrilineages, various male and father-led families, as well as clans as local subgroups. Then after that, the city of Sokanook was divided into 12 districts, which were assigned to the respective clans. Uh, the count there was leading the nation was a council of sacred clan chiefs in charge of administering the Sauk and the Meskwaki Fox Nation in itself, um, with chiefs in this council being recognized in three categories. You had civil chiefs, who were hereditary chiefs in charge of civil affairs. Then you had war chiefs, who were chiefs in charge of warfare, who would often gain their position after they demonstrated their ability to conduct war. And then you had ceremonial chiefs, or chiefs who were in charge of ceremonial affairs. And here is the source that I use for all of that information. Now, this leads me to the next section. What did Sauk and Meskwaki Fox villages and cities look like? Well, so first off, I mentioned this in my previous video on the Choctaw Nation, but I think it's important to mention at least one more time in the series. Oftentimes, in my experience as a historian and archaeologist, especially as a historian and archaeologist who's worked at museums involved with Native American nations, such as the Cherokee and the Muscogee Creek nations, oftentimes I and other archaeologists and historians have noticed a pattern where we see uh, or hear people thinking that all Native Americans, period, across the board, lived in teepees. And that is not the case. Teepees are a very specific type of house that is low. It was used by Native American nations of the Great Plains. Outside of the Great Plains, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, and the Northeast, the Southwest, the Northwest, the Southeast, etc., most Native American nations in those regions generally lived in some type of permanent or at least semi-permanent dwelling. In the case of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, they lived in things like birch bark houses, like you see here, oftentimes very similar to the longhouse that was used by tribes such as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or say the Powhatans. But they would also live in, especially and much more frequency, live in uh, log cabins after contact with Europeans. They lived in log cabins before then, but again, they began to live in cabins in much greater frequency after European contact. And here are some of those birch bark houses that I was talking about, in addition to the one you've already seen. All right, now that we have looked at the makeup of their villages, let's take a look at the economy of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. So first off, much like most of the Native American nations of the Eastern Woodlands, the traditional economy of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nation was generally an agriculture-based economy that revolved around the cultivation of crops such as corn, beans, and squash. An economy that was predominantly controlled by women. Meanwhile, the men would go out and hunt and harvest animal meat, hunt animals for their meat, such as deer and bison, as well as various types of fish, such as catfish. Then, uh, after the War of 1812, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations would go on to become major participants in the fur trade, which you can see on these maps here. With the predominant furs at first that were being harvested being beaver furs, but they also harvested and traded furs to American companies, fur companies such as they would also trade it to the Hudson Bay Company, but they would trade it to things like the American Fur Company or the Missouri Fur Company, or say the Northwest Company. And these furs would include things like raccoon pelts, bear pelts, uh, among others. And you can see that here: beaver pelts, bear pelts, and raccoon pelts. But another major part of the economy that deserve of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox economy, but that definitely deserves mentioning, is the long running, like for centuries, uh, long running uh, Sauk and Meskwaki mining of lead, which was a economic practice that was controlled by Meskwaki, Fox, and Sauk women. And you can see sort of that mining activity here. And they would they would mine this lead, Sauk and Meskwaki Fox. So when they would mine the lead, oftentimes 4 to 5 thousand pounds of it in a singular season, which they would then go uh, down to St. Louis and trade and other American trading posts and trade them for $2 per pound, which is a lot of money when you think about it. And there's St. Louis there, and there are the American trading posts. And there are some of the various Meskwaki, Fox, Sauk, and Winnebago uh, mines, lead mines, or Ho Chunk is another term for Winnebago lead mines. However, uh, not all would be well for the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations at the conclusion of warfare between the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations and the United States. In fact, despite the peace between these nations, there would be a growing there were the let me put it this way: the cultural conflicts between these nations would continue to grow really exponentially uh, in the coming years, starting with Illinois statehood and the expansion of white Americans into the Native American lands of Illinois. So, Illinois would officially become a U.S. state, in 1818 CE, as you can see here on these maps here. Afterwards, the population of white Americans would grow to roughly 50,000 people in the Missouri and Illinois territories, uh, where they would migrate out there for new farmlands and homesteads and things like that, as you can see in these pictures here. With that would come increasing occurrences of white Americans uh, who were beginning to see Native Americans as racially inferior, which would often lead to frequent outbreaks of personal violence against Native Americans and other white families, which would be fueled by things like liquor and the fact that law was, the law and order was very loose in this new state in the Missouri Territory, meaning that oftentimes these white settlers who were fighting each other as well as attacking Native American communities were unrestrained by the law and would eventually lead to men fighting and killing each other over a wide range of issues. There's sort of an instance of that here where a mob is burning down a white settler's home. Uh, Also, during this time, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations would become fairly accustomed to sending delegations of chiefs, such as the Sauk chief Keokuk and the Meskwaki Fox chief Wapello, to United States officials, such as the now superintendent of, quote, Indian Affairs, William Clark, and this would happen during the 1820s CE. Then we begin during this time to further exacerbate the conflicts between white settlers, white American settlers, and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations. John Jacob Astor, an individual whom we've already talked about in my video on his Astoria expedition that I will include in the iCard, would after he'd founded his American Fur Company, would begin to gain a monopoly in the fur trade and would begin to undermine the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nation's participation in said fur trade, with this undermining of their participation really beginning to happen around 1822 CE. Furthermore, white Americans would begin to steal lead mines and would undermine the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox mining economy, starting really starting in the summer of 1822 CE, which you can see this here. This is one of the first communities to start doing that in 1822 CE. And there's a map of the various American lead mines here. To exacerbate this even more is hunting grounds and access to resource-rich areas such as the lead mines. The Sauk and the Meskwaki Fox Nations would send 600 warriors to raid the Dakota Nation to gain access to hunting grounds and more resources in the summer of 1822 CE, right around the same time that white American settlers were seizing control of the lead mines in the region. 2 years after these events began happening, 10 Sauk and Meskwaki Fox delegates, including Fox Chief He Who Shakes Rocks, would travel to Washington, where they would agree to relinquish claim to the land they possess in Missouri and the southeastern tip of Iowa. The treaty would also include a provision for a small 119 acre triangular area to be set aside for the use of mixed marriage families, usually white men who had married Native American women, with the idea that these mixed family citizens could live there but cannot buy or sell any of the land. However, this arrangement did not last very long, with this treaty being signed in August of 1824 CE. And there is that just little land cession that is known as the, quote, half-breed tract. Half-breed is a very derogative term, so the proper term is mixed marriages, but if you want to refer to the event, it's the half-breed tract. So I do apologize to um, basically all Native Americans who may be watching this for using the term half breed. But unfortunately, this is what the event was known as, so I had to use the title that we know it by. So I do apologize. Just 1 year after these land sessions of the sessions of Sauk and Meskwaki Fox lands in Missouri and Illinois, the United States begins to fear that uh, various Native American nations that reside along the Missouri, Mississippi, and Missouri, Mississippi rivers and the Great Lakes will be induced into war due to the ongoing wars between other Native American nations, such as the Dakota Nation and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. Hoping to prevent this, or at least reduce the warfare between these nations, the United States would send William Clark and Lewis Cass to meet representatives of the Dakota, Sauk, and Meskwaki Fox, Menominee, Iowa, Winnebago, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, also known as Ojibwe and Chippewa, as well as the Council of Three Fires of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, also known as the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi nations at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, on August 19th, 1825 CE. Eventually, after a long discussion, a peace treaty would be signed between all Native American nations present, with the treaty becoming known as the First Treaty of Prairie du Chien, the treaty being ratified on February 6th, 1826 CE. With the primary articles of the treaty being the establishment of peace between the Dakota Nation and their neighbors, the Ojibwe, the Sauk, the Meskwaki Fox, and Iowa nations, as well as a demarcation of formal boundaries among each of the Native American nations, often called the Prairie du Chien line, with the treaty claiming the United States sovereignty over the territories. And tribes are to only hunt within their acknowledged limits. And here is the source that I use for this information. And here is a map of those various boundaries as described by the First Treaty of Prairie du Chien. But there would be, despite this peace, there would be a major consequence of this treaty, and that was an event known as the Winnebago War. So, shortly after the ratification of this treaty, a French Canadian man and his family would be murdered by a Winnebago raiding party. After the United States found out about this, the Winnebago Nation would send 6 men to Fort Crawford, or they would be detained by the United States Army, with the United States Army demanding that the Winnebago chiefs identify the killers of the French Canadian man and his family. And this would happen on July 4th of 1826 CE. And there is Fort Crawford there. Shortly after this, after detaining the men, hearing rumors that the Winnebago were going to attempt to free the prisoners, the garrison would be moved from Fort Crawford to Fort Snelling in October of 1826 CE. After this, a series of events would begin to take place. First, various Winnebago chiefs and individuals would hear a false story of the execution of the Winnebago prisoners, despite the Winnebago prisoners having already been set free. They would also hear that some Winnebago women had been sexually assaulted by American riverboat crews along the Mississippi River. And all of these came along with continued white American trespassing onto Native American lands, including those lands of the Winnebago, Uh, and all of these would eventually convince some Winnebago, including Winnebago Chief Redbird, to take up arms against the United States. And this happened because, in the eyes of Redbird and his group that he had gathered as a war party, the timing seemed right, especially because of the evacuation of the garrison from Fort Crawford to Fort Snelling, which appeared to be a sign of weakness, a sign of the United States' weakness in the eyes of Redbird and his war party. And here's Redbird here. Redbird and his group would then begin to raid several white American settlements, initiating what is known as the Winnebago War. However, Redbird would be unable to recruit any allies from the Dakota Nation, the Potawatomi Nation, or even other Winnebago villages and towns, as they all preferred to be neutral. This would eventually lead to the quick defeat of Redbird's band by the United States militia, seen here on the left, uh, and their Native American allies, including the Menominee, seen here on the right, which would officially end the Winnebago War in September 1st of 1827 CE. But this war in itself, alongside the effects of the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, would result in the changing of United States policy on Native Americans in the region. And this is because the Winnebago War itself would go on to convince several United States officials in the Illinois and Missouri states and territories that white Americans and Native Americans cannot live peacefully together, and that Native Americans should be compelled to move westward. An idea that was already circulating heavily and was being pushed by individuals such as Andrew Jackson. This would eventually lead Illinois Governor Ninian Edwards to begin petitioning John Quincy Adams. Here's Ninian Edwards and John Quincy Adams here. The specifically the John Quincy Adams administration to remove the remaining Native Americans from Illinois. And he would do this towards the end of 1827 CE. And this would be even further exacerbated by the successful by Andrew Jackson's victory and election as president in 1828 CE, president of the United States, that is. And here's Andrew Jackson, and here's that election. During this period of time, while the United States was beginning, or at least leaning towards Indian removal, removing Indian removal, air quotes, removing Native Americans from Illinois territory, the Sauk and Meskwaki nations, specifically the warriors, would go away for a winter hunt west of the Mississippi. And while they were away, white Americans from the Illinois and Missouri would rush into the city of Saukenuk and take much of it over, to the horror of many returning Sauk and Meskwaki Fox chiefs. And this would happen in the winter of 1828 and 1829 CE. Because of this, Winnebago medicine man and prophet Wabo Kashik would suggest to Black Hawk that the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations should return to Saukenuk in the spring, despite repeated warnings by the United States, quote, Indian agents, that the next summer should be the last time the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations reside in Saukenuk. And again, this happened in the winter of 1829 CE. Using the 1804 Treaty of St. Louis as a justification for the seizure and ownership of Sauk and Meskwaki Fox land by the United States, the United States Indian agents, again, Indian agents, convince Sauk and Meskwaki Fox chiefs, such as Keokuk, to permanently move west of the Mississippi to Iowa, leading Keokuk to become a major political rival to Black Hawk. and this would happen in September of 1829 CE. And there is Keokuk, and here in the gold dots are the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox villages west of the Mississippi. Shortly after Keokuk agrees to permanently move the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations west of the Mississippi, Andrew Jackson's quote Indian Removal Act would be passed by a narrow vote of 28 to 19 in the Senate and 101 to 97 in the House of Representatives on April 24th of 1830 CE. And as you note by how close these votes were, this was by no means a universally supported bill. In fact, it was a very contentious bill, but it was a bill that Andrew Jackson had been trying to push for years. And of course, this would lead to growing tensions between the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations and the United States. With these tensions really beginning to rise, due at least in part due to the rising tensions between the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox, Dakota, Menominee, and Winnebago nations after a combined Dakota and Menominee war party massacred a Meskwaki Fox peace delegation in on May 5th of 1830 CE, a peace delegation that was on its way to meet with United States officials. Also, this massacre, the Menominee and Dakota faced no consequences from the United States, which will be important in a minute. During this time, while this massacre was going on, Black Hawk was beginning to gather a large number of followers, including members of the Odawa, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi nations, which would eventually become known as the British Band for their use of a British flag. And he would repeatedly, between the spring of 1830 and June 25th of 1831 CE, attempt to return from the west of the Mississippi, from the west bank of the Mississippi to the city of Saukanook, before each time being forced to return west of the Mississippi due to pressure from both the United States and the majority party of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations, which was led by his rival Keokuk. Also during this time, especially during Black Hawk's repeated attempts to retake Saukanook, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox majority led by Keokuk would officially cede Saukanook to the United States in what is known as the Fourth Treaty of Prairie du Chien, furthering the divide between Keokuk and Black Hawk's faction. Shortly after this, in retaliation for the previous massacre of the Meskwaki Fox peace delegation, a party of Meskwaki Fox and Sauk warriors would kill 26 Menominee at Prairie du Chien, resulting in the United States arresting the Meskwaki Fox warriors involved in the massacre, which again is not something that happened when the Menominee massacred the Meskwaki Fox peace delegation. So this unwillingness to punish the Menominee and the Dakota for their massacre against the Meskwaki Fox nation, the Meskwaki Fox peace delegation, but their willingness to punish the Meskwaki Fox and Sauk warriors for their actions against their allies, the Menominee, would in itself begin to increase the tensions between the United States and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. After return, and shortly after this, in fall of 1831 CE, after returning from east of the Mississippi, Sauk civil chief Neopope would erroneously tell Black Hawk that the British band that the Winnebago prophet Wabukashik had negotiated a military alliance between the Sauk and the Meskwaki Fox nations and the British Empire against the United States. And here's Neopope, and there's Wabukashik right here. After receiving this information, Black Hawk and his British band, consisting of 500 warriors and 600 non-combatants, would enter Illinois and head to the Winnebago village known as Prophetstown, not to be mistaken for Tecumseh's Prophetstown. There are two different Prophetstowns. While ignoring emissaries from Keokuk's faction in the United States telling his band to return west of the Mississippi. And he would do this on April 5th of 1832 CE. While en route to the Winnebago Prophetstown, Potawatomi chiefs Shabana and and I apologize for probably butchering this, Wabanisi would inform Black Hawk that the Winnebago and Potawatomi nations will in fact not join the British band, and any members of the Potawatomi and Winnebago nations that are already members of the British band are, are now considered traitors. And this would happen in May of 1832 CE. So, without supplies, adequate provisions, or allies from other Native American nations, Black Hawk would realize that his band was in serious trouble, and he would decide that would be best to attempt to return west of the Mississippi. However, while he was in the process of doing this, he was confronted by United States military forces led by Major Isaiah Stillman, who would attack Black Hawk's band despite Black Hawk's request for peace, which would result in Black Hawk's warriors attacking and defeating Stillman's forces in what would become known as the Battle of Stillman's Run, initiating an event known as Black Hawk's War on May 14th of 1832 CE. Which now brings us to our next major section, Black Hawk's War. So, with the outbreak of hostilities between Black Hawk's British band and the United States, Black Hawk would go on to accept an offer for shelter from the Rock River Winnebago village, and would take his band further upriver to Lake Koshkonong in the Michigan territory that you see here. Where they would camp in an isolated place simply known as the island. With the non-combatant members of his British band secure, and with his Winnebago and Potawatomi allies, albeit the ones who were already members of his group, Black Hawk's warriors would begin to raid settlers, with the first attacks being Winnebago band ambushing 6 men near Buffalo Grove, Illinois, on March 19th of 1832 CE, as well as the killing and the mutilation of an Indian agent and 3 other men in the St. Vrain massacre on May 24th, 1832 CE. The Winnebago and Potawatomi warriors who were already taking part in the war were sometimes motivated by grievances not directly related to Black Hawk's objectives. And this can be seen in an event known as the Indian Creek Massacre, which was conducted by Potawatomi warriors in response to a settler named William Davis, who had previously dammed the creek near a Potawatomi village, which prevented fish from reaching the village, and the Potawatomi would actually attempt to just negotiate with Davis and ask him to take the dam down, but Davis ignored the protests of the Potawatomi and actually assaulted a Potawatomi man who tried to dismantle the dam. So because of this, the Potawatomi would attack Davis's homestead in what is known as the Indian Creek Massacre on May 21st of 1832 CE. While all this was going on, while these battles were being won by Black Hawk's band and these raids were being conducted by Black Hawk's band, news of Stillman's defeat, the Indian Creek Massacre, and the other smaller attacks would actually trigger panic among the settlers, with many fleeing to Chicago, which was then just a small town, not the metropolis that it is now, which would lead it to becoming overcrowded with hungry refugees. And here's a picture of what Chicago looked like in 1832. In response to the defeats at the hands of Black Hawk's British band, the United States Army in the region is reorganized and placed under the command of officers such as Brigadier General Henry Atkinson, Brigadier General Milton Alexander, and Colonel Henry Dodge. Here's Atkinson, Alexander, and Dodge. In addition to organizing a new militia army, the United States would also begin to recruit Native American allies such as the Dakota and the Menominee, reversing the previous United States policy of trying to prevent intertribal warfare. All right, so now that we've started looking at Black Hawk's War, I think it is time for us to take a look at the soldiers and weapons of the United States at the outbreak of the Black Hawk's War. So at the start of Black Hawk's War, the U.S. Army looked something like this, with infantrymen looking generally something like this, wearing this sort of type of uniform, while cavalry, specifically dragoons, mounted gunmen, looking something like this, with actually dragoons and cavalry beginning to take more and more of a front seat to U.S. military affairs as the U.S. began to expand further and further into the Great Plains. And the weapons that were used by the United States military generally consisted of things like, in the case of dragoons and military officers, they would use for close quarters combat things like sabers, whereas infantrymen at the time used these little short swords called artillery swords. And then some on an individual basis, on a personal basis, a lot of U.S. soldiers would have various variations of the Bowie knife, such as this one here, which is actually the earliest design for the Bowie knife. And they would use that because of its effectiveness in close quarters combat. Of course, they would use small arms like pistols, and then they would use various different types of muskets and rifles, with some of them being loaded from the front and some of them being breech loaded from the stock of it. And with that, let's get back to the main course of Black Hawk's War. So, despite further minor victories by Black Hawk's British band, the United States Army would begin to win key battles, such as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, seen here on the left, and not to be mistaken with the battle of the same name from the War of 1812, with this victory happening on June 16th of 1832 CE. And then the United States, shortly after that, would win the Battle of Apple River Fort on June 24th, 1832 CE. Despite the United States victories, the inconclusive Second Battle of Kellogg's Grove on June 25th of 1832 CE would lead Andrew Jackson to become displeased with Atkinson's handling of the war, and would eventually result in Andrew Jackson appointing General Winfield Scott to take command of the war effort. And here is Winfield Scott, and there are the various battles of Kellogg's Grove. During this time, Black Hawk and the British band now reduced to fewer than 600 people due to death and desertion, would leave Lake Koshkonong and head for the Mississippi River as the militia began to approach. Though the militia, in turn, would also be misled by Winnebago scouts sympathetic to the British band. And this would all happen in July of 1832 CE. Eventually, Winfield Scott's army would catch up to to Black Hawk and the British band, defeating them. However, Black Hawk's warriors would manage to fight the U.S. military forces long enough to delay these military forces and allow the majority of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox civilians in the group to escape across the Wisconsin River on July 21st, 1832 CE. After this battle, that would eventually become known as the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, a messenger from Black Hawk would shout to the militiamen that the starving British band was going back across the Mississippi River and would fight no more. However, unknown to Black Hawk, who assumes that Scott got the message and were no longer pursuing him, um, the militia did not understand the message as their Winnebago guides were actually not present to interpret. And this would eventually lead to the British band being prevented from crossing the Mississippi by a steamboat outfitted with an artillery piece, which was patrolling the Mississippi River, with the steamboat being called the Warrior. And this would happen on August 1st of 1832 CE. After the Warrior eventually left, the Black Hawk would decide to go and at least attempt to seek refuge in the north with the Ojibwe. Though, despite his decision and despite his attempts to get more people to follow him, only about 50 people, including Wabukashik, would agree to go with him, with the others remaining determined to cross the Mississippi and return to Sauk and Meskwaki Fox territory. And here is Wabukashik, and there is the Ojibwe Nation there. Now, I think this is very important to point out. The next slide, as seen on this trigger warning, involves very deeply disturbing content related to the death of children and infants. So if this triggers you, if you don't handle this stuff well, which is understandable, I want to make that clear. If you don't want to see or read about things like this, be forewarned. But this is something that cannot be left out of the video. So, just the day after the battle or the skirmish with the steamboat, the Warrior, and Black Hawk and his small group of 50 individuals leaving the majority of the British band, the United States forces would catch up to the members of the British band attempting to cross the Mississippi River, where they would proceed to kill everyone, literally everyone who tried to run for cover or cross the river. Of course, they would kill the men, but they would also kill women and children who were also shot dead, with one soldier even going as far as to shoot an infant that had been set adrift on a large piece of cottonwood by the mother, who was hoping that the baby would float to safety. And this would happen on August 2nd of 1832 CE and would become known as the Battle of Bad Heads. And you can see this event here. And again, you can see basically everyone is being massacred with extreme brutality. A really horrible thing that the United States Army did to these people who were just attempting at this point to go home. And there's, no excuse, of course, for the shooting of an infant that had been set adrift on a piece of cottonwood bark. All right, so with that now leads us to the aftermath of Black Hawk's War. So after this horrible massacre and essentially the conclusion of Black Hawk's War, the remnants of the British band, including Black Hawk and Wabukashik, would surrender at Prairie du Chien and would be eventually sent to meet with Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C., somewhere between August 27th, 1823 to April 26th, 1833 CE. And here is Washington, D.C. during the 1830s. Eventually, Black Hawk and the captive members of the British band would be released, but not before being sent on a tour of American cities such as Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City, among others along the way in the Midwest. And this tour would begin on June of 1833 CE. And there is Baltimore here and New York here during the 1830s. Now, this brings us to the next large legacy, the large effect of Black Hawk's War, and that is Indian removal and its relationship with Black Hawk's War. So, first off, despite the Winnebago allying with the United States and the Keokuk faction and the faction of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations not participating in the war, the United States would use the Black Hawks War as an excuse to force the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations, as well as the Winnebago Nation, to sell 6 million acres of land in eastern Iowa in what will be known as the Black Hawk Purchase. And that area is the area here stated in yellow. And this would be sold to the United States for payments of $20,000 per year for 30 years and a reservation in western Iowa, among other provisions. However, despite this treaty, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations and the Winnebago Nation would be eventually forced to sell all of their lands in Iowa and relocate to Kansas. And this would happen between September 21st, 1832 to 1842 CE. Furthermore, very similar to the Winnebago, despite the Potawatomi Nation siding with the United States during Black Hawk's War, the Potawatomi would also be forced to sell land to the United States in the Treaty of Tippecanoe on October 26, 1832 CE, and eventually another treaty just a year later in the Treaty of Chicago on September 26, 1833 CE, as part of Andrew Jackson's quote Indian removal. And you can see the lands that were ceded as part of that treaty, those various treaties here. Eventually, both of these Potawatomi land purchases would lead to the removal of the Potawatomi to Kansas on what would become known as the Potawatomi Trail of Death, which resulted in the death of over 800 Potawatomi on the way to Kansas. This would happen on November 4th of 1833 CE. All right. Now it is time to take a look at where these Native American nations are today. Starting with, of course, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations. So the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations exist in various different forms. You have the Sauk and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska, which you can see here. As well as the Sauk and Fox Nation located here in modern day Oklahoma. And despite the previous and continued attempts by the United States to eradicate Sauk and Meskwaki Fox culture, as well as the culture of all Native American nations, the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations are continuing to hold on to their cultural practices, something that is seen in other Native American nations, such as the Winnebago, with the Winnebago Nation being located in Nebraska, known as the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. Here again, you can see that they are still holding on to their cultural practices. You can see this also in the Potawatomi Nation, who are located in Oklahoma. So you find them on the map right here in this little area here, and they are known as the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. of Oklahoma. And then there is also the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, seen here in, I believe, Kansas. And yet again, they are still continuing to hold on to their cultural practices despite continued attempts to eradicate their cultures. All right, so with that, that ends our video on Black Hawk's War and the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nation's attempts to hold on to their national lands in Illinois. As with my previous video, I hope that you enjoyed some parts of the video, especially involving the aspects of cultural makeup and economy and things like that of the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox Nations. But I also really, really hope that many, if not all of you, did not enjoy. Really hope y'all understood the gravity of things like the Bad Axe Massacre, and did not take away those things as being positive. Uh, so I know it's very odd for a content creator to ask you not to enjoy one of their videos, but I really think that again, due to my experience as an archaeologist and a historian, I have often ran into people who are still happy about what the United States has done to the Native American peoples and nations. So I really think that we need to stop that. So I really hope that, at least in regards to what the United States did to the various Native American nations of the Midwest, such as the Winnebago, the Sauk and the Meskwaki Fox Nations, the Potawatomi, etc., are not something that you enjoy. All right, so with that, remember to like, share, and subscribe to this video. If you want me to cover any of the things I mentioned in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and I hope you all have a good day.